All right. Well, hello, everyone who may be watching this later. What we wanted to do today was take an opportunity to, people have been curious about Cluster API Azure and how it works and all those good things. And Timmy had made a great suggestion of checking out what it would look like to actually release Cluster API Azure. So we have a rare opportunity, and a rare opportunity is there is a bug fix that needs to happen. So I'm going to take that opportunity to record a quick session about how to do this. Right. So without further ado, I'm going to just clear the screen and get started. All right. So first I'm just going to open up the repo and code, and we've written some instructions on how to do the release process. The instructions will need to be updated because I have like a little crib sheet of what needs to happen instead in certain steps. There is a pre-fight manual, which is kind of like, hey, if there are any modifications to the release policy, you should take a look at this. You should create a release commit. This is no longer true. I'm not going to do the release commits. I think that's kind of a waste because we then have to wait for someone to approve the release commit as opposed to just cutting on any one specific SHA, right? The release tool that is in the repo right now is kind of a copy pasta mess. I don't personally use it. So we're going to go through the manual steps, right? And I'm gonna do some improv jazz on the manual steps to get this done. So the first thing that we want to do is tag the repo and push the tag. But before we do that, we should make sure that we are checking out master. Timmy, can you see this okay? Should I? I'm going to pop it one bigger.
That's perfect. I can do that.
All right. So I want to make sure that the remote is updated. All right, that's good to go. Now I'm going to reset, make sure that my local is clean. So that is the last update that we had. So the update to CAPI 0.13, the reason behind that update, if anyone is curious about taking a look, nope. Right, the reason for that was a bug that was introduced in the 0.1.2 version that I think Timmy and I simultaneously discovered, as well as some people upstream. That was quickly fixed, so hat tip to Justin Santa Barbara for pushing the new image for that. If you want to read more about it, it is Cluster API 999. Controller image fails to run. You can see we popped in here. So part of it had to do with some cached image layers that were on Justin's local as he was creating the image. So that's all fixed up now. And this has been backported into the release-0.1 branch of Cluster API. So moving forward, that's the change that we made over here is just for visibility is to bump that to 1.0.1.3. You can see the package lock is now just a change in Cluster API and the version bump. And the changes, if you're curious about them, change to the makefile to bump the controller image, adding the Docker pull to force the pull as opposed to having the cached image. And you can also see that the bump is here too, right? So when we do our build, it will pull in the manager image YAML, which is what we need for the cluster API controller manager images to not go crazy when we build clusters, right? So that's the reason that we're doing this today. So let's get started, right? We are going to, what did we say we were going to do? We were going to tag it, right? So git tag -s, right? I'm going to tag this as 0.2.1. That's what we're releasing today. And I don't go crazy with these messages because they don't get seen. Just adding 0.2.1 there, right? putting in my PIN to sign. So that is actually signing this tag before I push it up, right? I can do a quick, so now I can do a push. So my remotes here, right? So this one is the HTTPS remote that I'm going to be using to push that up, right? So git push up and v0.2.1. Oh no. Oh, it's not set on this. Okay. All right. Spelling my username correctly, and I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can pull up my password manager and copy my GitHub token. So if you have ever used GitHub on the command line and you have two-factor authentication enabled, as you should if you're part of a Kubernetes org, the requirement is that you also generate a token, right, to do releases. Well, a token to do GitHub operations on the command line, right? You cannot use your password for that because you're not able to do any two-factor authentication using just your password, right? So still looking for my token, looking, found it, and okay, that's in. All right, gonna share my screen again. Okay, so you can see that that tag is pushed. And if we switch back over to the Cluster API Azure repo, we can see that as well. Releases, right? And 0.2.1, that's pushed, yay. All right, so next step is create a draft release in GitHub and associated with the tag that was just created, right? So draft new release, v0.2.1, boop. And we're going to call the release the same thing. I'm going to leave this saved as a draft for now, and we'll get back to that in a little bit. Right, so now I'm going to actually check out the tag. Like I'm technically where I need to be already, if we just see there, right? But for sanity's sake, we're going to check out that tag and detach head, right? So head's detached, we're actually on the tag now. It's the same commit, doesn't really matter, but you know. So now we're going to run make release artifacts, right? So if you want to see what make release artifacts is doing, nope. Right. So it's doing a build of a few different things, and I've lost it. Right. So we're doing a build of using the Linux AMD 64 toolchain to do a build of command cluster CTL. And then we're also using the toolchain for Darwin 64, AMD 64 to do a cluster CTL build. And then we're making an output directory and doing an install of the stripped cluster CTL into Darwin, Linux, and then we're also tarring up the examples that are in the repo. So command cluster CTL examples, right? We're tarring up this information, right? So any questions, Timmy, so far? All right, cool. Right, so to look at a little bit more of what this is doing, right? We're doing cluster CTL. So there's a version info package here that has some information about what's built, how it's built, point in time information for when you're cutting that. Ooh, maybe one bigger. So nothing too crazy. I know not everyone speaks Bazel, and I barely do as well. So I won't go into any of the Baselisms. I don't think they're required for this specifically, but all right. So back to our instructions. What were we doing? Right. We're going to run that make release artifacts, and this will generate that output folder that we were talking about. Here. I'm just going to do a time on it too.
Cue background music.
So Bazel's off doing its thing, doing a compile of the cluster.ctl binary, which is one of the assets that we publish in the repo when we cut a release. And I mentioned that I'm going to do some improvisational jazz on what the instructions are written for the release process. I do owe an update for some of the instructions, so I know the things that shouldn't happen. So I'm going to skip the things that will go bad by following it step by step. Yeah. Timmy's like, that looks like a PR.
Smells like something.
Yeah. So one thing to note that may be obvious to some, but certain operations here require elevated privileges in the repo, right? So the ability to push tags is reserved for people who are actually admins of the repo, right? So I think myself and Nick are probably the only people who can push tags right now. Again, this is a process that doesn't need to be done by everyone, but part of it we're also going to validate the fact we're going to validate the binaries, right? So we're going to not only do the release or do the pre-release bits, but also spin up a cluster API Azure instance and just do some quick smoke testy pokes at it before we actually decide that this is going to go live, right? Hey, Nick. Can't hear you.
Hey guys, what's up?
Chilling like a villain. So just a note that this is recorded, or we are recording currently. So
I don't know why I have to say that when I join. No, thanks for the heads up.
Yeah. So I was just walking through some of the tagging process. Hello. Some of the tagging process, and we've done a draft release after pushing the tag, and we're actually generating the binaries right now, which will attach to the draft release, and then we're going to write some release notes. Some janky ones. There are only I think 2 commits that we've done since. Let's check it out. That we've done since
020.
020, yeah. Merely 4 days ago.
Tags worked, or the releases.
Say what?
I never actually knew how the release feature in GitHub worked, so this is neat to see.
Yeah. So something to note about our versioning scheme is what we do is boop. We try to have something of a support policy, and this is kind of evolving as upstream works through designs for cluster API, right? So some of this support policy also needs to be updated. I have a draft PR to do some of that, but essentially what we're trying to do is Azure Provider 0.2.0 supports cluster API 0.1. Right, so this is currently incorrect. The PR fixes that, right? But So essentially everything for Azure minor version 1 was everything to bring us up to this point, right? Kind of all the MVP baseline work that we did in the repo, the refactoring of the Platform 9 code. The 0.2.0 is kind of like, okay, we've gotten a little bit past baseline and we want to synchronize between the cluster API upstream version and the Azure provider downstream version, right? So our minor 2 matches their minor 1. Right. And then also this chart will probably expand. It's currently incorrect right now because 1.14 has been released. But 0.2 should support both 1.14 and 1.15 as it lands. So 1.15 is scheduled to land tentatively for next week, Monday, right, Nick?
Yes.
Monday? Okay, cool.
Wait, actually, let me double check that because I have, for some reason, in the back of my head, it might be Tuesday.
I think it's June 17th. Yeah. So, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, let me
All
take
right.
a look.
So we have stuff, right? If we look at this output directory, we can see that we have the examples.tar, the Darwin, and the Linux binaries, right? So these are the ones we want. We are going to assume that they work for the time being until we test them. And I'm going to figure out where my Go directory is. Source. Zigzag, output. And we're gonna drop those in.
Yes, June 17th, so next Monday.
Cool. All right, so that should take a minute or so to upload. And from there, we're gonna start walking through the getting started instructions and see if we can actually produce a successful cluster based on what we've written down. Right. Actually, there may be a pre-step to that. Attach the tarball, attach the cluster CTL, write the release notes. We're not going to do that right this second. But we do have a release notes template, right, which you can see in pretty version. If I do this, right, so that's our template, nothing crazy. You can see for the 0.2.1, I kind of went bare bones with this. I'm going to backfill some of the release notes on that one. I think so. The biggest thing for 0.2.0 is the 0.2.0 is the first time that we essentially landed on v1 alpha 1 or 0.0.1.0 of upstream cluster API, right? So I think I was holding it up for the sake of rolling in a few more PRs, support for existing resource groups and end-to-end tests and support for existing VNets. And those are going to end up taking a little bit more time than I originally anticipated. So I didn't want to hold up the opportunity to actually like stabilize on an upstream cluster API version. So I cut this one, right? And we're cutting this one now to fix this bug fix, right? What we should be able to do, what we should feel comfortable in doing is exercising this process as often as needs to be, right? There's no, we don't currently have any specific release cadence for Cluster API Azure, right? Will that change in the future? Potentially, but right now we're pretty fine. All right, so the next piece, so we have the release notes off to the side. We are going to push and build and push the container image, right? So somewhere I have something that is not an error. Our logs. Okay, this is the one, right? So I think the last build I did, I was writing notes about like, okay, what are the things that are missing in our documentation? And one of the thing, because I built a release and totally borked it. I was like, oh, cool. That's something I have to write down now. So I need to commit this to the repo. So what we're doing, so the main, aha. So I should have read this before I actually, I should have read this before I actually pushed it, made the artifacts, because these are no bueno. The reason for that is that during the release artifacts process, it does some variable expansions, and reads in some of the information about the registry, the pull policy, and the manager image, right? So we're going to do this again. It's great that I have that recorded. It's always fun to blunder on camera.
It'll just instill confidence in our new contributors.
Yeah, it's like you too can do that.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm swapping those version numbers, and I'm going to rerun this now. And the reason that I'm not going to fix those docs immediately is because if I start making changes on the docs, the Git branch will no longer be clean, and messy things will start to happen with the release process. So I'm going to preempt that. Okay, well, that was quick. I think because I have the, all right, that's the right time. Cool. Yep. Because we compiled a bunch of stuff already, so we were ahead of the game. All right, so they're re-uploading now. And while that's happening, we are going to, again, using a lot of the same environment variables, we're going to build the Docker image, right? So we have two container registries that we use, right? One is Kate staging / cluster API Azure controller, right? And you can see that these are kind of fuddy-duddy tags that we're looking at. And these this repo, Kate staging, is used for development for the maintainers, right? So development of images. So as we're testing out images, we're pushing to this repo, and occasionally cleaning them up as you do. So, Nick, do you still need this one, the SOG one?
No, go ahead and clean it out. It's
Bye.
Bye.
All right. Okay, so
Stupid newbie contributor thing. How would we get access to this? How would we get access to this repo once we were a contributor? If we were doing releases, what do we have to do to get access to that?
Talk to me. Essentially is the process right now. Only myself and Nick have access to this repo. So as a contributor, there is no requirement for you to have access to this repo, right? Any container registry should work, except I want to say ACR.
But for the purposes of doing release engineering in the future, this would be prerequisite for that, correct?
Right. Not specifically this one, but we're gonna sidestep to one more repo, right? And so these are the official images, right? Mapping to each of the version tags. You can see from here, from the security scan, we went from passed to unsupported. The reason behind that is that right before we cut the 0.1.0 release, I switched the images to distroless. So distroless, there are reasons that I don't know that are unsupported with clear scanning, right? So that's the reason that you're seeing that unsupported If you are building images yourself, just for people who are listening to the call, I probably should have started the build, right? For people who are listening to the call, if you can build on distroless, you should, because it's safer. Lower attack surface for a lot of things, and being able to, so for our sake, we really only need a Go binary, right? So a pretty flat image that supports that within the environment is really all we require. So distroless is a good fit for us. There's also an upstream effort to move more things to distroless. I think that it is in AKEP. Right, so sig release. I was like, I think I approved this. Yes. Rebase images to distroless. So if anyone's curious about checking that out, walks through some of the different types of images that you would encounter in Kubernetes and why distroless better, and some of the graduation criteria, as well as the images that need to be done, right? So all of that information is in Kubernetes enhancements, the KEPS repo, and then sig release, and then you can find the rebase images to distroless KEP. Right. Cool, cool, cool. All right. So while we're waiting for that, blurb. If anyone is curious about what is happening in that Docker file, really nothing crazy. We're making a work directory. We're copying in the, so when we're using a Golang image, and we should switch this to just Golang 112, so we're getting the latest. But copying in the package command and vendor directories, doing a build, copying the binary from the resultant build into the image, and setting the entry point to manager, right? Nothing crazy. Right, so that is done. And now we're going to do a push. Right, and you see we've done this before. And magic. Right, so we've got our 0.2.1 image now, right? So now that we have, so we have a lot of the things that we need right now, right? We have the direction somewhere, right in front of me. So we have the image, we have the binaries, right? We haven't written the release notes, but because we have the image and we have the binaries, that means we can actually start to exercise the getting started docs, right? So this is the part where we go off and we build us a Kubernetes on Cluster API Azure, right? So first things first, it says get their latest release, right? We already have the latest release locally, and we haven't published the binaries yet, right? So we're going to use the local stuff, right? So I am going to switch over to yet another terminal. Make that bigger, right? So I'm just going to copy out. So one, I'll do a make directory of project Kate's capsy 0.2.1-0, right? And then I'm going to copy out star to that last thing, right? And then cd that last thing, right? So here I am. all of our fancy stuff is here. I'm also going to, actually, what do I want to do? I want to do this. I'm going to go back where I was for a second, because I have something very important there. Right, so I have an environment file here, which includes my credentials, so I don't expose them on screen, as I am known to do. We're going to switch back. All right, so let's get back to those instructions. Right, it says, let's set up an environment. Let's make sure that the environment variables are set. We already did that. Now we're going to take that tar and untar it. Boop. Right, and we're going to set some settings. Not to. So I'm just going to take this, and this basically means like it's me. I'm testing 0.2.0, and this is the second time I'm doing it, right? So I'm just going to change that to say it's me. I'm testing 0.2.1, and it's the first time I'm doing that, right? Replace this. And because Microsoft likes that I tag things or make it clear that I'm the one using them when I'm testing on their accounts, so gonna make sure.
Specific stuff that we're going to need for potential release engineering for this account or that sort of access, or is the plan that we will leverage our own accounts?
The plan is to leverage our own accounts right now. As the base of frequent contributors increases, we may consider talking to Microsoft about what more people getting access to the sponsorship accounts. But currently we run the, we not only run the CAPC testing, but also the actual end-to-end tests for cloud provider Azure, right? So cloud provider Azure is not cluster API Azure, but cloud provider Azure is actually the cloud controller manager implementation for Azure, right? So the scale testing and stuff like that is done on that account, and for that reason, it's fairly sensitive to. So what I'm doing is I'm just exporting some variables as it mentions over here to customize my deployment, and boom. And now I'm going to do the generate.yaml, right, which should take those and tell me, hey, here's what your resource group's going to be, right? That's good because that's what I set, right? And it's going to be over here, and this is the cluster name, right? Okay, so I've got most of the things that I need in place now, right? And I can copy this. And so hopefully anyone who's used these instructions, like it's simple enough, like there are no dollar signs or anything in the code blocks. Like it's simple enough to just be able to copy and paste a lot of these things, and that was my intent there. So I want to do a time on that too. See how long that takes. Boop. Right. So that's running in one screen. I'm going to open up two other screens. Right, because I want to tail some logs, right? So we're going to wait until kind comes up. And while we're waiting for kind, we are going to go over to my special demo thing. Right, and make sure that I grab the cube config from kind, which should be up at this point. Yep, up. And then I also want a time of how long it takes for the pods that I care about to be up. All right, so we've got the Azure, we've got the Cluster API Controller Manager. These are the two ones I care about, really, right? This is the one I really care about because this is the one with all the important CAPC logs, right? And I'm going to have this command at the ready. Kubectl logs Azure Provider Controller Manager 0-n Azure provider system is the namespace, and -f for following the logs, right? So KiNet had an error. Don't make me do live debugging. All right, so control plane is coming up, etcd is coming up. Core DNS is going. All right, so we're just about there. Right, and in the background, you can see that, you know, it's just waiting for the machine to be ready, right? And it's going to keep spitting this out until we're done, really. All right, so Azure, that's the one I care about, right? So it looks like it took about 1 minute and 19 seconds. That's cool. That's about average. And now we're going to tail the logs, right? Right, so people who are watching this and are worried about these errors that pop up first, it's checking for a resource group that doesn't exist yet. That's absolutely okay. Remember that, you know, in Kubernetes, everything is or hopefully everything is a controller, right, in some way. So we're doing reconciliation loops over this information, right? So the second time around, it does a check for the resource group. It finds that it's not there. It does the create of the resource group, right? So the reason for this is this actuator that's running is actually the machine actuator, right? So the machine actuator handles information about the machine, right? So how big should this machine be? What is the image type that I'm using for the machine? What is the resource group, the security groups that need to be attached to it, things like that, right? The cluster actuator, these things both start at the same time, right? So the cluster actuator is actually the one that is responsible for creating the resource group, the VNet, the security group, you know, and the route table for the nodes, right? So because they're kind of running at the same time, it's, you know, the first condition that the machine hits is the fact that the resource group is missing. The second time around, it will find the resource group because the cluster actuator is running alongside, and we'll kind of play catch up there, right? Right. So you can see it's creating load balancer, subnet, internal load balancer, blah 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 blah, and all the certificates. We're happy. Right. So we've gotten to the point where the machine actuator is running again, and it's creating the NIC. It's got the NIC, it's creating the VM now, right? And if you want to see this GUI style, you're going to try to log me into the VMware one first. Yep. Okay. So we're switching over to the, hoping I remember my password. That's not it. So this is the Microsoft account, and I had mentioned before that we kind of use this for, you can see we kind of use this for the cube tests, test infra, right? And then these are mine, right? So this is the one we care about. And we can see, one, we've created the security group, we've created the resource group, excuse me, and we have created a bunch of resources, right? And so what's happening now is the control plane is probably, are we at the startup script? No, it's still creating the control plane. But the next thing to happen is the, where are we? Is the deployment script that will run to configure all of the kubeadm bits, the dependencies in kubeadm bits, right? So creating VM extension startup script. An additional thing, if anyone is interested in taking this on, we also need a successfully created blah, right? Because right now you kind of have no idea what happens here until it fails, right? So
is this that machine issue that you were referencing in the issues?
Which machine issue?
machine update should signal completion.
That's a different one.
Gotcha. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine. And essentially, like, I think we need to do a better job of closing the loop on different like we have a loop, right? So, there's a start and an end kind of where it's the same place. But we should say when we're at the beginning of it and when we're at the end of it, right? So there are a few error messages that you will find, or a few log messages that you will find that don't necessarily have that information, and that's one of them. Right. I was like, what thing do I click to find this, right? So you can see the startup script now exists, and it's in transitioning state, which means it's getting dropped on the box and it's getting ready to run, right?
So you would like that to be displayed that, hey, startup script is in transitioning state as of right now, ideally.
Yeah, I mean, I think mentioning the success or failure is enough. We could do the individual states, but I think that, at the moment we might have bigger fish to fry. It's something that we should probably just document and move on, and probably mark as a help wanted or something. Okay. All right, so that will take a little bit. Any questions while we're waiting?
No, I'm actually probably gonna have to drop off in just a second.
It's like, I don't have a question, it's more of a comment.
Yeah, it's boring. No, I'm kidding.
So this is another thing to fix. That's right here. Should actually be lowercase pwd. Right. All right, let's check again. Still transitioning. All right. So I'm not sure if I've ever timed this step, but it will take a little bit. And this, if we're kind of right in the range, should be around 17 to 20 minutes. Let's say 15 to 20 minutes. And now I'm just impatient, right? So I think while we're waiting is a good time to say, let's write those release notes. Right. All right, so here I'm replacing any instance of version with the version. Right. I want to remove the instructions, comments. And again, this is going to be one that we don't have much to say here, right? Outside of, let's do this. I'm going to kill all of that stuff. this is a kind of a first draft template. There's a good likelihood that I'm going to switch some of this stuff up. And there aren't really any limitations or, but you see I mentioned all known issues should have GitHub issues filed against them. I have a few known issues in my head that I am going to file GitHub issues against. And we're kind of keeping a running tab of that on 7. No, different issue. 2, nope. 4,
In your
right.
head, it's a great place for them, clearly.
Right. So, so some things that I noticed last time I was cutting a release, I didn't have my environment set, right? So we should do an early fail if the environment variables are missing, right? Kill out of that quickly. As a result of some provisioning mishap, the error that was outputted to the screen for the portal exposes a private key, right? Something we need to fix. So make the script a little less brittle. So what happened is I think the pull of CRI container D, that tar, that download failed, and that download failure caused the entire thing to fall apart, right? So we should do like a curl with a retry max 5 or something like that, right? We precede like a fake node name in the certs just to make sure that the cert thing passes. So we need to do a little edit of the timing for the certs, right? Because the cert contains information about the public IP FQDN, and we need that to write the cert, and we won't have that information until after the public IP is actually generated, right? So we need the cert generation process to happen after that, and then we can remove the fake cert information. There's some updates to the machine, the scope, the cluster scope and the machine scope that need to happen. Those are kind of already in progress, using Logger everywhere. So I will show you the PRs that I'm kind of talking about. All right, so we have wire context-based logging and scopes, and sorry, there's a dog barking outside, so apologies for that. And use Logger everywhere, right? So you can see that there were some updates done here to the scope, and the updates that were done here were kind of just to pull in this Logger information, right, and clean up the way that that's listed, right? And then also to switch to use the Logger instead, right, instead of klog, right? So the reason that we're doing this is here, right? We're going to fix some of the errors too. Logger, right? So what's changing here is we're basically adding some new information to the struct, right? The parameters for the scope, right? Now, by adding the logger, that means I can pass a context for the logs across the entire scope, right? So every function or every method that uses a scope in some way means I can pull out a log, or I can pull out a context for. So if I have the cluster scope versus the machine scope, right? I can scope the logs that I get to the objects that are spitting them out, right? Which is useful when you're looking at stuff like this, right? Actuator, and I have no idea, was this the machine actuator or was this cluster actuator, right? So the whole point is to be able to apply some context across these logs to let you know what's happening. Also consider the instance where you have a management cluster that is dealing with more than one cluster, right? It would be helpful if we had like the cluster name or something, right, across the context of the log, right? So that's kind of the purpose for adding some of the stuff in. We don't wire any of the methods with the new like cluster name contexts well, we do it for a few places, looks like. So this one's getting the namespace, right? And yeah. So we continue that along the cluster scope code, right? So logger param with name, right? It's giving me the API version, it's giving me the namespace, and it's giving me the cluster name, right? So now we're starting to get a little bit more useful information out of the logs, right? But the functions or the methods that use these scopes need to also be wired to know that they need to access that additional information or provide that additional information, right? So that is work to be done. And part of the reason that this was worked up was for the sake of using, for the sake of adding the end-to-end tests, right? So the reason that the end-to-end tests are critical, outside of the obvious reason that they're critical in general, is that with a project that's starting to gain traction, and the smaller amount of maintainers that we have, when a big change comes in, the requirement around that is essentially for me to do exactly what we're doing right now: vet the tests, do human smoke testing of the cluster before accepting the change, right? So because of that, it would be a lot easier if I could add an end-to-end test to our test framework and get signal out of that instead of having to dedicate time to do that, right? So every bit of time I have to dedicate to that means we're not doing prioritization of the backlog, or we're not writing actual code, right? So the hope is that spend some time on writing the end-to-end tests so that we can enable more people to contribute frequently, right? So this is something not to be concerned about, right? This end right here. What this means is that it's saying that the container doesn't exist. The reason the container doesn't exist is because if we go over here, so one, we're updating. So one, we've finally gotten to the point where the control plane is up, right? And it's saying I'm going to update the information about that, right? And it's now creating the target cluster, right? So the target cluster is actually the cluster that is out in Azure, right? So remember that we started off, there are two phases, right? We started with the bootstrap phase, right? So we spun up a kind cluster, right? Spun up a kind cluster with kubeadm and essentially shot the config that we wanted. So the machines, the cluster.yaml, the provider components, the add-ons, right? Shot that into kind and said, go create that somewhere, right? Read that stuff out and go create it somewhere, right? So where it created it was Azure, right? And now that we have the cluster that we need, we're now pivoting the assets that exist in the kind cluster over to Azure, right? So the assets, as in not the quote unquote physical or cloud resources, right? But more so the idea and the information about them that are contained within the cluster spec status and the machine spec and status, right? So it's telling you right here, I'm going to go look for the list of things that I need to go do stuff to, right? I'm going to scale down the controllers that exist right now, right? So when you saw that this container is no longer able to be found, that's what was happening, right? That container is getting spun down, right? And if I was to try to do anything here, we can see connection to the server is refused, right? This kind cluster has now been destroyed, right? So this bootstrap cluster no longer exists, right? So it's gathering a list of all of the things that it needs to move. I'm going to look for the machine classes, nothing to do there. I'm going to look for the clusters. I found one cluster. I have to move that. It's going to read out the stuff that's in that cluster, right? Get the machine deployments, right? No machine deployments, no machine sets. I found a machine though, right? So I need to move that machine over, right? So now it's waiting for that machine to become ready. And then it's doing the same checks, that same reconciliation loop against that machine that it was doing before, right? When it was on the bootstrap side. So now that that's all done, right? So it's writing the status to the new target cluster, right? And now it has one more job to do, and that job is to create the node, right? So if we wanted to see what's happening there, at this point you have information in your repo, because I can't spell. You have information in your repo to get access to that cluster, right? So let's go back to the instructions and see if we also see that, right? Right, so waiting for that to become ready, you can now access your cluster, blah, 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 right? And then we said, if we do the export, we'll do this in a separate screen, and we'll make sure that this is lowercase, right? And then I can do a cluster CTL, just a few commands to show you that this thing is working, right? That's the information, yay. Right, we'll do a get nodes O-wide. Right, so you can see we created 2 nodes. And we've got a master role and a node role, as expected. And then we can also, yeah, let's take a look at those pods. Right, OY dash all namespaces. Right, so now, Timmy, if you remember, we had a cluster API controller manager with a container error, right, before.
Yep.
And we no longer do. So we know the bug fix works,
Yay.
right? So we're just about done, right? And then if you're curious about the cluster API specific objects, right? We've got get clusters, right? And then we've also got get machines, right? And if you're curious about more information on that stuff, we can do a CTL describe cluster og 0.2.1 -0, right? And there's some key information in there, but this will be destroyed in quick order, right? We don't have a backend pool or anything that's going on there. Actually, we might not be writing the information back to this, right? So this is another potential for contribution, right? This is not super critical. We don't need to pass this to anything, right? This is just kind of information for the user, right? You can see we have some key material, not a big deal. This will be destroyed soon, but we can tell what namespace it's being built in, any annotations, the API version, the finalizers, self-link, and the pod and CIDR and service CIDR blocks, right? So yay, that's Cluster API Azure cluster built successfully using the assets that we published, right? Or using the assets that we draft published, yeah. All right. So
almost done.
Almost done. All right, so the next thing that we want to do is find the thing that I was writing in, which I think is here, right? So find all the x.y's and change those to those and make sure those work. That's what we want. This one will fail. Or no, it doesn't. Yeah, good. Doesn't. Sweet. Right, those are our new docs. And so what do we want to say here? Let's take a look at switch back over here. let's take a look at our log, right? So over here is where we cut the 0 to 020, right? So in terms of user facing, we kind of only really care about mentioning user facing things, right? So update, so we did two things really, right? First one was we updated, what just happened there? And that was, you did that on getting started, right?
That was the developer.md.
Okay. All right, and we'll provide a link to that. I'm actually curious if, so we'll do it two ways. We'll do that one and then blah, blah, blah. Right. So we'll do, and Timmy, while you're, while you're hanging around, why don't you watch the releases for the repo, right? If you're not already watching the repo, right? Because when we publish this, it should send an email to you. So we'll cool, yeah.
Okay, I gotta bounce.
All right, dude.
Good job on the release, homie.
Yay.
All right, see ya.
Later, bro. All right.
Yeah, I'm watching.
You're watching the repo? Timmy?
Yes, I am. Yep.
As in like not like the watch button for releases, right?
Releases. Yeah.
Right here.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do releases only, or you can watch it all, right? Right. So what do we bump that to? 013. Right. I'll pop that in there. And we'll also do a ref of the. Actually, it's in the PR. That's fine. Right. So that's what we got. Nothing crazy. We're going to take that and find the screen. Dupe. Aha, so it does do that. Cool. Perfect. All right, so shall we publish this release?
Why the heck not? It's a document change and we updated a number and it only took an hour. Let's go.
Boom.
We got to get some of this automated. Wow.
Yeah. So there are definitely some so the thing that took the longest really was spinning up the cluster, validating that worked.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, so if we have and really what part of this is exercising the tools, right? So we need to figure out what we can do to exercise the tools, right? So part of the end-to-end test should be so we're going to start off like, can we build a cluster, right? Can I build a cluster object? Can I build a machine within that cluster object, right? And once we solve the base case for the end-to-end test, I think that we should expand it to exercising the tools, like exercising cluster CTL, right? And that way, if we're consistently validating that we're building the binaries and we can exercise the tar, unpacking the tar and walking through that entire process, then we can say that we can automate the release process, right? But there are some parts where, and I think that, overall as a project, we haven't figured out where we want to go in terms of like provenance, right? So image provenance, provenance of the bits that we're providing as assets, right? So like in an ideal world, I'm also providing, SHA-256 sums of each of these things, right? And our multiple, SHA-1, SHA-256, SHA-512, right? Of these things, right? So people can validate against them, and then we can also have our tooling validate against those things. But also, this release is verified, right? This is GPG signed, right? So solving for that too, right, is not something that is trivial, right? And that's the reason that there are bottlenecks on some of these things, kind of across the Kubernetes repos. Because if we're doing image signing and stuff like that, then we have to be concerned with who has the keys to do that, right? And can we have them available to do the thing that needs to be done, right? Push the button to turn the release. So anyhow, you should have received an email, or you will receive an email shortly. I just got one for this new release.
Yep. It's 2 minutes ago.
2 minutes ago.
From this Augustus. Who's the? Who's that?
Who's this Just Augustus guy, right? Right. So now we have new 0.2.1 release. So anyone who's watching this, go ahead and try that out. Have fun with the CAPT. Hope you enjoy it. And I will stop sharing. Any questions before we go, Timmy?
No, not at all. It was just useful to see what that process looked like. I think that, like, at minimum, there's areas where people can help relieve some of the burden here, right? Like, I know I can be a test monkey for, does a cluster spin up appropriately, right? Like, so at least maybe I can assist with something like that and like leave people who are more equipped to handle the architecture of this actual code base to doing that. So that's kind of where I'm going to try to focus some of my attention here.
Yeah, for sure. So what I want to do is, now that I've actually put together the grand project board of all the things that I'm working on, I think I have a better vision of what needs to happen next. So I'm going to start walking through. And what we can do is maybe we can do a live. We've done the live release session. We've already done a few, both in person and on video, builds of Cluster API Azure, right? So I think what would be cool next is to touch on some of the project management stuff of it, right? And do a grooming session, right? Do a public grooming session for our stuff to see where we're at.
And
right?
maybe we can get some help with that too. I can take that on. I can see if we can get some actual help with that space too. Sweet.
In what sense?
Maybe we can find somebody who actually wants to help, like, own some of the project management stuff for this.
So the upside of that is that the people who are working on this, myself, SIG PM, right, equipped to handle it a little bit, but also this is a project that is kind of co-maintained with Microsoft, right? And so the people on the Microsoft side that are involved are engineers who work on AKS and AKS Engine, right? And we'll be bringing some of those people up to speed as we so we're working on doing our second half planning for SIG Azure overall. So I'm actually working with their upstream program managers, Lockie and Craig, to lay down some of that stuff. So as we walk through these boards, I'm going to be walking through them with people who do this for a job, right? So it won't be too bad. It won't be too bad. Yeah. But there are other places in the project that would be want for project managers. So I don't want to spin them off on this if they don't need to be. Cool. So I don't know if you have seen this board before, but I occasionally groom it. It's pretty up to date, actually. I just need to update a few comments on it. But
Is this
I'm waiting.
project board for Cluster API Provider Azure?
Yes. Are you already in that?
Yeah, I've seen.
Okay, cool. Right, so that is fairly up to date. If you filter on, if you click any one of the tags, if you click any one of the priority tags, right, you can see that stuff that is priority important soon is kind of either in the to-do or in progress columns, right? And then the stuff that is priority important long-term, you can see they are mainly in the backlog and to-do, right? So there's a fair amount of prioritization that's gone into this work already. We just need to make sure we keep up the pace and start doling out some of these issues to people who are interested in them. So anyone who is taking a look at this video later can feel free to hit the project board or hit the issues tab and go ahead and search for click the issues that are help wanted. Those are the ones that we want help on. All right. So thank you everyone for your time. Thank you, Timmy, for suggesting this and hanging out with me, being my my sounding board.
No problem. Silent
All right.
sounding board at that. But good work, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Later.
Yeah. Bye.